brief introduction of our great guests. And I just want to say that we're thrilled to have Araceli and Aram Veeser, our new faculty in the program. And we'll be hopefully having more meetings or events in the spring with biographers and memoirists and oral historians talking about their process and in writing their work. So I'll turn it over to one of our students, Walker Simon, who's working on a biography of Frida Kahlo. And Walker, I'll turn it over to you now. Walker, you're muted.
Okay. Buenas tardes, estimada audiencia. Good afternoon to all the participants and people tuning in. It's my honor to introduce Araceli Tinajero. And I'd like to keep this introduction short because everyone came to hear the professor, and it'd be great if she had the most time possible. When I was looking through her book, I saw all these great images. So I'm taking advantage of this era in Zoom. I'd like to share a few to help stimulate the imagination when you hear her descriptions. So hold on, share screen. Okay. Okay, so first I have to do the honors with a brief summary of Dr. Tinajero's background. She's a professor at City College and the Graduate Center, and she has a broad range of research interests. As you can see, biography, Orientalism, Modernismo, Transoceanic Studies, and Mexican, Caribbean, and Latino literature in comparative perspective. So I put together a few images, as I said, of, from the book and the covers of other publications, so you can see the spectrum of what she's put out as books. So here we see Araceli at the tender age of 18 or so, when she arrived in Japan in the 1980s, not knowing the language. She learns Japanese quickly, and she absorbs the culture. Here she is as a finishing school. It's not exactly called a finishing school, but maybe that's the closest analogy, where she learns etiquette.
No, it's like a presentation. I don't know if I'm going to stick with it, actually.
Okay.
I
have to get on a call at 5:30.
Okay, I can just.
All right. Okay, so right, just to start up, the closest school would be a finishing school where she learns etiquette in Japan and how to wear a kimono, and I'm sure other things as well. She earns a living as a waitress, and well, Japan becomes one of the primary areas of her interest, and this paves the way for a series of interesting publications. So among her books are those that explore the links between the Orient and Latin America. So we see this, it's interesting that it's not only Hispanic America, but also the Brazilian world. This in English is Cultural History of Spanish Speakers in Japan, and this would translate as Orientalism in Hispanic American Modernism. She also has books on Cuba. These are two that she's edited. This is one that's very interesting about someone reading, literature and other things to cigar factory workers. And I know just from the background in Cuba, this had a lot to do with the labor movement. And as for her native Mexico, she's put together these books of essays. Now, Professor Tinajero will be in conversation with Dr. Veeser. So here are just the highlights. He's also a professor at City College in the Graduate Center And he also has a wide gamut of interests, including this biography and autobiography, British literature from different eras, and post-colonial literature. He's very prolific. His resume runs 10 pages, packed with many publications. But I just had to settle on one. So his forthcoming book encompasses seminal US cultural theorists. And what he does is he interviews 18 of them, and they were instrumental in paving the way for the ascendancy political correctness by challenging ideas like the traditions of hierarchy and privilege and US superiority. He maintains that their thinking spawned new philosophies like queer and feminine genius, and it also contributed concepts to an insurgent culture such as the Me Too movement. So without further ado, I will turn you over to Dr. Tinajero, who's in the very capable hands of Dr. Veeser. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I will let Professor Harold Veeser speak, and then we'll keep the conversation, I guess.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Tinajero. And thank you, Simon Walker, also for that lovely introduction. And I wanted to thank also Sarah Covington for arranging this, and Marilyn as well. There are students here, I think, from my current seminar on Neo-Baroque and the aesthetics of bling, and I wanted to point out to them, shout out to them, that Professor Covington has written a great book called Wounds, Flesh, and Metaphor in 17th Century Literature that feed right into our topic of the performance of suffering in the aesthetics of bling. To mention Simon Walker's introduction and his wonderful rehearsal of some of Professor Tinajero's projects, he referred to them as broad, but I think also you note that in the amazing sequence of books, there's a solidly coherent project. For example, take the lector who reads to the cigar workers, tobacco workers as they roll cigars. He's both a reader and a performer. Then take her book on Latin X Orientalism, which completely revises the European Orientalism that we know as a top-down kind of imperial maneuver from the work of my own teacher, Edward Said, that Araceli's book about modernism in Latin America and its version of Orientalism is a completely different Orientalism, because in a sense is composed by writers on the edges or the margins of Western modernity and modernism, both within and without the mainstream. And that's very much the predicament of her more recent book, detailing the long and surprising presence of Latinx cultures in Japan, and vice versa, of Japanese and Latin America. And I hope we'll be able to talk about how that occurred in the course of this conversation. But all of this, I think, organically connects to Kokoro, the book we are discussing today. And in Kokoro, you find what is to me very fascinating, a person actually there, Araceli herself, at the intersection between two cultures. I mean, physically as a body, but also as a human subject pressed between two very pronounced and distinctive cultures. And these are not, central metropolitan cultures. Japan is, still recovering from its demolition in World War II. And Araceli is coming directly from Mexico, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, please, Professor Tinajero. So the things that I think repeat through her work are this interest in voice and performance as compelling aspects of her experience. And I think in the most extravagant example in Kokoro, maybe her devoted kinship to the emergent phenomenon of karaoke and appearances on popular Japanese television. Another factor, the work ethic and the almost puritanism and toughness of the Japanese, especially the generation, post-war generation of Japanese, but also what emerges is that the author herself shares a lot of these traits of hard work and strong endurance. A slightly different register from the puritanism of the Japanese, however. Another aspect that always interests me is charisma that mark and define experiences. So this is everywhere apparent in Kokoro, the book, but it's between the lines. You have to intuit that this is a feature that Professor Tinajero brings to her sojourn there. So all of these things made Kokoro profound and fascinating. I hope we'll touch on many of them. And I'd like to start by asking Araceli, how did you first decide to go to Japan? You had lived all your life in Mexico. Did you speak Japanese? Did you speak English?
No, I didn't speak neither English or Japanese. I grew up in a very middle-class Mexican family in Mexico City. Back then, there was a middle-class family. I'm afraid to say that the middle class no longer exists in Mexico. But I had the fortune of going to a public school that was in a very rich neighborhood. I didn't grow up in a rich neighborhood at all, but my father had the vision that if he sent his 8 children to a good neighborhood, that probably we will learn something different. So I came across a lot of foreigners in that neighborhood. And I was always very interested in new cultures. So I came across Japanese people from Senegal, people from Cuba, people from different places. And Japanese people were always so kind. So they said, well, why don't you come to Japan one day? And then I thought, I will go if you are inviting me. So that's how I decided to go.
Well, that's fascinating, and it points on to the topic of charisma that I hope we'll return to, because people are always inviting you to do things and go places, and they meet you and then they say, well, why don't you move in with us? Or they meet you and you have a car accident, you're in the hospital, and they come to visit you every day for months. So this is a mystery I want to explore with you. How do you do that? How do you do it?
I don't know. I guess it's good luck. I just meet the right people at the right place. People are always so kind to me. And that's what happened when I arrived into Japan with no money or anything. And I thought, okay, I have 2 choices. Go back or try to stay. And some friends say, well, stay, you should become a prostitute. What do you mean? So eventually I ended up working as a waitress. And this lady was so nice to me that became a second mother. So, so very good things happen to me all the time. But I also look for things. For instance, when I was in Japan, I wanted to meet this comedian on TV because that's when I realized I spoke Japanese. Is when while watching TV, this comedian was so funny, and I thought, oh, I want to meet this guy, and I went out of my way to go to Tokyo and to meet him, and I met him. So that those are the type of things I do. You know, it took me 5 years to get a job in New York. 5 years. I applied to every single position in New York because I wanted to be in New York. So I waited 5 years to land into my job at the city college.
Well, these fantastic descriptions of the way you learn to maneuver in a new, unfamiliar world are very powerful throughout the book. Let me ask, would your experience in Japan, going to Japan, would it have been very different, essentially different, had you been a cisgender male, for example? You noticed early on, I think on the plane trip over, that people, quote, studied almost everything about me, my eyes, my nose, my legs. Of course, voyeurism is not limited to Japan, and we could talk a lot about the Mexican and Japanese patriarchies and compare them probably, but you take a different approach, more clinical maybe, and say, well, later I learned that people focused on those features of my body when they weren't sure if I was Japanese or not. So you were physically present, and Japanese people are surprisingly frank, blurting out judgments on your body. Can you tell us more about that?
Certainly. Well, I look very Japanese, and not only that, my experience in Japan transformed me totally. So I act a lot like a Japanese person in many ways. But when I went there, I looked so much like Japanese people. So Japanese used to worship Westerns people from either Europe or the United States used to look at them like with a lot of respect, especially if they were like Caucasians, like white, blue eyes. So in my case, I was a little bit different. So they used to like stare at me and say, well, is she Japanese? Maybe yes, maybe not. So had I been a male, probably they would have had the same questions, you know, especially Japanese women who are, and back then they were very interested in foreigners, you know. But interested in foreigners, I'm not saying this in the bad way, but rather in a very respectful way. They used to be very respectful, and they always wanted to know about the culture and everything. So yes, I would say that if I had been a male, they would have looked at me with the same interest and curiosity, but with the same respect.
Mm. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that I'm thinking of your interest in performance, the performance of, you know, TV, the stand-up comedian, the karaoke performances that you're eager to do. You did a lot of other things that required a kind of performance, like the tea ceremony, or learning to make Japanese clothes. All of these things, but I'm also thinking in terms of performativity, the performance of a gender. Did you feel that you were called upon to perform your gender in some ways in Japan?
That's a great question, but I'm not sure if they were, if I was asked to perform my gender. I only know I'm very natural, and I don't think I can rehearsal things. I'm very spontaneous. That's why I was able to go on the TV show and be on live television in Japan. That was like big. But I guess it's because it was spontaneous. So I am like that. I like to be spontaneous, and I like to be put on the spot. Like right now, like I didn't know what you were going to ask me, and that's okay. I'd rather be natural, and I'd rather be embarrassed, and I'd rather say, well, I don't know, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm saying. Let me think about it tomorrow. So that's me. I like to be natural. And I connect that a lot to my teaching. I have my lesson plan. I teach, but also my students know that I can be very radical at times. Once I was teaching Spanish language, and I was trying to teach vocabulary to my Spanish 101 students. And I wanted them to build up on vocabulary. And I said, well, let's say that poetry is like what? So just tell me anything. And they say, how, this, that. And one student said, water. And I took a bottle of water like that, and I just put it on my head. And I said, you mean this water? The one that like, how I wash my head? So I like to be like that.
Yeah, I remember asking you, would you like to know what kinds of questions I'm going to ask you? And you said, no, I'd rather not know. So you like improvisation in its most radical forms, sure. But can you tell me about your gift for languages, which I can only, marvel at, because you went to Japan. How did you learn Japanese so readily? It's supposed to be a very difficult language. Not only speaking Japanese well enough to go on popular TV with a stand-up comedian and bandy jokes with him in Japanese, but also, writing kanji and practicing calligraphy.
I guess that's a gift. That's something that we were born with. And also it has to deal with how open we are to other cultures. Really, in my heart, I wanted to learn Japanese because I was there. So I went out of my way, and I am very obsessive. I can write the same character 1,000 times, or I can write a word 1,000 times. And so for me, it was very natural, and I wanted to speak. I wanted to talk because I love to talk. So that's the way I learned Japanese. Had I came to the United States instead of going to Japan, my English would have been a lot better, but my English came after my Japanese. That's why, funny enough, I speak with a Croatian accent, Croatian Middle Eastern European accent for some reason. So, but I mean, I love languages, I love them. So I guess when you are open and you embrace them, they just come down naturally.
I think you mentioned that you in part learned language by listening to that comedian on TV.
Yes, I mean, when I was laughing at what he's saying, I realized that I had learned the Japanese language. Because once you understand the joke, then you are part of the world of that language. So that's when I thought that was so funny, and I became obsessive with that show. And well, I mean, speaking out loud, I would love to get in touch with him to tell spoken, you were such a great inspiration to me about everything. And I talk about you in my book, by the way, he was so smart and so fast and so fascinating. So, and that was my school when I was in Japan, in a way, the TV shows.
You didn't go to an intensive language institute or anything to learn the language.
I didn't, because I was in Nagoya. Nagoya is about like 300 miles south of Tokyo. And that city is like off the main road per se. So there were very few language schools. So it was impossible for me to go to the university. Japan is extremely hierarchical. So you don't come with a sponsorship, you don't come from with a good scholarship or something like that, you cannot even walk outside that school. So there were like 2 languages institutes that used to teach Japanese language like once or twice a week. So that's where I went. So the university was out of my universe when I was in Japan. I never thought I would ever go to the university when I was in Japan, because I was already off the track of the Mexican institutions. And I was totally out the track of the Japanese institutions. So, I mean, when I was in Japan, it never even crossed my mind that I will ever attend the university.
Yeah, you seem to have no qualms about being completely alone and independent. And, but I wondered, not even having your own natal language to speak. You actually say at one point in your book that you were a little bit homesick for Mexican Spanish, for Castellano, and you say, quote, "My need to hear words, sayings, slang, malapropisms rather than nonstop Japanese," which is what I guess you were getting. How would you explain your divided attachments to Spanish and to Japanese? How would you weigh those 2 linguistic involvements?
Well, I was speaking like Japanese, and it's like I'm also a very practical person. So I used to think, well, this is the Japanese I know, so this is the Japanese I will speak up to here. So if I don't know any words beyond this, I will not talk. So I used to learn, my words with my dictionaries and things. So I used to speak very little Spanish, but I used to think, well, if it's not there, it's not there, I guess. So I wrote letters to my mother, which they were lost. And that was terrible, because if I had recovered those letters, this book would have been different, totally different. But I don't even have one single letter. So yes, I used to miss home a lot. But the Japanese were like so nice to me, People like so good to be true. Like Freud, when he went to the top of the Acropolis, and when he learned how life was too good to be true, what do you do with that feeling when you are up there and you realize that life is too good? What do you do with it?
Yeah, I wonder whether the timing of your trip to Japan helped to shape your experience of it, or made you feel more akin to that culture. And what I'm thinking of is that, as you point out, historical changes were overcoming Japan during this period, around the time you lived there. Japanese products used to be, I remember from childhood, dismissed by my father, especially my father, as the cheapest, shoddiest merchandise you could possibly buy. But by the early 80s, the cars, the motorcycles, the electronics coming out of Japan were top of the line, finest in the world. And this was, you were in the sort of pivot of that transition. So how did this transformation come home to you or shape your experience while you were there? You speak about the almost puritanical asceticism and work ethic of the older generation, the post-war, immediately post-war generation, and of the very sharply 180-degree contrast of their big spending, debt-ridden, consumerist children. So you lived through that. What was your analysis of that, and what feeling did it give you?
Well, once this historian who I admire very much told me that everything is timing. Everything is timing in life. So I went to Japan when Japan was extremely rich. When the children of war had became rich after working like 30 years nonstop, like 14-hour shifts. So I arrived to a rich Japan, where when there were very few foreigners and very few Latin Americans. So I was like the difference. So for them, it was very interesting to know me, to learn Spanish. They knew about my culture. I had a lot of respect.
Yes.
But later, in the late 80s, it changed because the Japanese law changed. And all of a sudden, you had these Latin Americans could go and work in Japan with visas. So then all of a sudden, they didn't have like a Mexican who was lost somewhere there. You had like hundreds and hundreds of Latin Americans going there. So the scenario changed totally. So when those Latin Americans arrived into Japan, they also were in conversation with the children or grandchildren of those Japanese people who had been the children of war. They didn't know how to cope. They didn't know how to save money. They didn't know a lot of things. So I was so lucky to be there with the children of war who taught me so many things, like how to save and how to eat with so little and how to be very precautious about life and about everything, how to be extremely respectful. So I was so lucky, and I thank God for that, because that was something that I wouldn't change for 100 lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, would you say that you're a very strict person? I mean, that you have a leaning toward that kind of hard self-discipline?
I am very hard on myself. I am very hard. I never think that what I do is good enough. I never think that my English pronunciation, no matter how many times I try, is good enough. I never think that my writing, no matter how many hours I put into, is good enough. My teaching is not good enough. So I am very hard with myself. And because of that, I was able to be so close to the Japanese of that time, because they were very hard on themselves. And so that was a blessing.
Yeah, I think your host, the owner of the restaurant, is in one of those photographs that Simon showed at the beginning of the talk today. She's sitting on your right, but she was often kidded or disparaged by her employees, right, as being extremely tight-fisted and, you know, ungenerous and very strict about expenditures, nothing excessive. And then in the same line, you were said to, there are a couple of instances in the book, like when you're performing the repetition of the kanji letters and your sister or fellow students start kidding you about that. How many times you're going to do that? And also you have a day off. The restaurant is closed that day. And your coworker asks you, well, what are you going to do? And you say, well, I'm going to come in and do some things that have to be done around the restaurant. And the coworker says, but it's your day off. We don't have work tomorrow. And you say, well, but that's what I feel I need to do. And she ends up going with you. So in that sense, you're more you fit better with the post-war generation of the Japanese rather than their no good children.
Yes, I think so. I mean, and it also says, it also talks about like the Mexican ethic of work, like we Mexicans I'm not trying to be nationalistic here, but we Mexicans are very hard workers and very loyal. And so for us, work is everything. And so I work the way my parents told me, like how to work and how to be very, very clean, very strict, very on time, very everything. So for me, that work ethic was something I was very familiar with. So I responded accordingly. So it was, we used to get along so well, because, and also we Mexicans are very respectful people, and so are the Japanese. Not that the Americans are not, by no means, but so for me, that was just second nature. So, I got along so well that it was terrific.
Yeah, you avoid both the nationalism of Mexico. All your commentators and reviewers comment on this, that when you talk about Orientalismo, you don't actually practice that. You don't go in for binary opposition. So the Mexicans are all like this, but the Japanese are all like that. You somehow manage to finesse that or sidestep it. I mean, and it does seem to be built into almost the structure of your book, in the sense of, well, it's subtitled A Mexican Woman in Japan. So it does have a kind of invitation to do this kind of wide generalizations, comparing the two cultures. How did you avoid doing that? Or what do you think about that?
Well, I just wanted to write some of my memoirs about Japan, some my experiences in Japan, and I didn't think about. I'm sorry, but this is the truth. I didn't think about the readers. I didn't think about Orientalism. I didn't think about nationalisms. I just wanted to be true to my heart, to my very heart. And I remember, and one person here in the audience, as the person I can see, Professor Dulce Garcia, she read the first chapter of my Kokoro in Spanish. And I remember asking her, what do you think? Should I go and read like other memoirs to get some inspiration? And she said, no, don't do anything. Just keep writing. Don't think about, So when I wrote Kokoro, I didn't think about any of these. I just wanted a voice that convinced me of what I wanted to say. So once I was able to put that word into paper, then I thought, this is the type of voice I have to keep going with. So that's the voice I just and that's the voice of the 18-year-old that went to Japan.
Well, you had a very astute critic in Professor Garcia. And I now understand much more. So but I'd like to ask you also about performance and your interest in performance of various kinds. From karaoke to sumo wrestling to baseball, you attend a lot of baseball games. You also did a more, traditionally cultivated activities like flower arranging, making fashionable clothes. You learned to make Japanese fashion, and of course, writing learned books. So would it be fair to extend the meaning of performance to the rather strict rules and scripts for daily costuming and behavior in Japan? In other words, if you go to a funeral, there's a very set protocol that you need to follow. Or if you're even drinking a cup of tea, you have to proceed in a very settled, prescribed manner, and the execution of those rules correctly is a kind of performance, right? So what about the various kinds of performances that you are interested in or that you record over and over in this wonderful book?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I love to watch sports. I do exercise myself, but I don't do any sports particularly. So I love soccer, I love sumo, I love baseball. So that as an spectator, because I always admired sports. I was born like that. So when it comes to the performance of being very strict in Japanese society, I just follow rules, If people say you have to do this, like that, and like that, I just follow with a precision of a scientist. I just follow rules and I don't question. So probably that's something weak of me. I don't question. I just, okay, you tell me I have to do this, like that, I do it. So for that reason, it was very easy for me to live with the Japanese, because I used to follow exactly the way they told me I had to do things. So, and in academia, I do the same thing. If the provost tells me I have to do this, I follow. So I just don't question authority. I was born like that, or I was raised like that, I guess, because my father was very strict.
Yes, but it's not as though you perform these rules or obey these rules in a kind of grudging or, dutiful way. You seem to make something out of the activity of following rules, something in excess of mere obedience. You see what I mean? That you seem to enjoy activities that are defined and structured by a very, complex set of rules.
Well, yes, that has to do with my spontaneity, with the way I like to operate, because I can be very sure about something and follow the rules, but then if I think about something different, I may move totally and perform something totally different. Like when I was in college, I thought I had two paths: to become a Japanese language professor, or to become a business person. And I was set. That was it. I didn't like the horses that you put things like this. So that was it. But then in the last semester, I decided, I was in this class that I wasn't very happy because I couldn't get the books. So I decided to go to the bathroom. I never left the classroom like that because I'm very structured, you know. So I went to the bathroom, and when I went to the bathroom, I heard these people speaking in Spanish. And I said, why are you speaking in Spanish in this classroom? They said, because this is a Spanish class. I said, Spanish class? I didn't know that Spanish was a subject that was taught at the university. Because I was like this. I went to the university to study Japanese, and I never even looked at the printed catalog. That Spanish was a subject. I never got that far. So that's when, you know, I thought, oh my gosh, if I could become a Spanish teacher, oh my gosh, that would be like so wonderful, you know, like, so that changed my life, that going to the bathroom that day.
I see. Yeah. What about the subsequent years? I guess we're reaching sort of the end of our time, but so after the time of Kokoro and your experiences in Japan, I assume you went to graduate school, but then you went and taught at Yale, and you taught at you had a professional career as a professor. Do you have any reflections on that? How does it relate to the book Kokoro?
Well, my first book, which was the topic of my dissertation, was about Spanish Latin American modernism and the Far East, because I had some background and I could understand the topic better. So then it came to my book of El Lector, which had that dealt with the readers in the tobacco factories in Cuba, which, I mean, that book had nothing to do with the Far East or anything, but it was also very challenging. So after that book, I really, something happened to me, and I'm just not gonna say it here. So hopefully with the hope that you can read the book, you all can read the book. Something very terrible happened to me. Then I thought it is time for me to write something about my time in Japan. However, had I not written had I not written the book about the readers in the tobacco factories, readers in Cuba, I would have not been able to read this memoir, because that book was like a rehearsal on how to write a history of something, how to construct the figure of someone, how to do field work, how to do so many things. And I spent so many years on that book that was, you know, it was a good exercise to come to the memoirs. So I wanted to write the memoirs because that's something that I thought I had to do and to say. It was for my own heart, for my own being that I did it. And well, I'm glad I did it. And I am so glad that the book was translated into English by Daniel Shapiro, my wonderful translator. Thanks to him, this book can be read in the English language. So that's something that I thought I had to do. You know, so the other books, you know, I always think that is something that I need to say or to do, or something that I need to explore.
Well, just to finish up, may I follow up on that comment on El Lector? Because of course I want to hear how that writing of that book trained you to write your memoir, but also the connection that I immediately felt with the topic of El Lector was, oh, well, here's a combination of high culture and popular culture. You know, here we have a person in a popular setting, cigar factory, who is appointed to read books. And the books that are read are fairly, you know, classical texts, 19th century novels, Gil Blas, the thing, stuff that you would read in a college class. So this seemed to be an intersection that I noticed in your autobiography also, where, on the one hand, you have very refined activities like flower arranging and the tea ceremony. On the other hand, you're on a raucous, popular TV show and going out to do karaoke. So I wonder, if that's like a continuity between a lector and the way you work in other fields.
I think it's a continuity because when I came across the topic of el lector, I mean, first of all, I was fascinated by the fact that there were these people who were hired to read in the tobacco factories while the workers were rolling tobacco. So when I started researching the topic, I realized that there was no one single book on them. So, but I didn't write a book because there was not a book about them. It's because I was so fascinated by the topic. I said, what do you mean that these people, like they read to the workers like this? They are paid to sit down there and read novels. So I was totally fascinated. So I went out of my way and I did so much research but then because there was not one single book about this topic, my research kept growing and growing and growing. And then I realized that I was writing a book, but not only a book. I was writing a history book, an anthropology book, an ethnography book. And I thought, OMG, I'm writing, what am I going to do with these historians that they know everything about Cuba? They know everything about Tampa. They know everything about the tobacco workers. Mm. So I had to be extremely careful about what I did. Mm. And I also had to be very, very cautious about all every single detail that I put in the book. And I also had to build this figure. It was like writing a biography of someone. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to write like a book that was boring. And also my passion was there. I wanted to write about these readers who did this and did that. So that's the way it went. So that was my rehearsal to write Kokoro.
So yeah, since we're speaking in Sarah Covington's biography and memoir program, how did building up the figure of the lector prepare you to build up the figure of yourself in Kokoro?
Well, with the lector, I had to put bits and pieces together. I didn't realize there were readers in Cuba. So I went to Cuba and I interviewed them. I took pictures. I spent weeks and weeks with the tobacco workers rolling and listening to the reader. So I had to do archival work. I had to do interviews. I had to photograph. I had to learn the history of tobacco. My gosh, that's, so that helped me to altogether to think about, I had to write a figure of someone that didn't exist before. So when I came to write my book, Kokoro, I thought, oh my gosh, but I only have a couple of pictures. I don't even have one letter. What am I going to do? I only have a medal that was given to me and I have so I had so very little bits and pieces, and I thought, what am I going to do? So then I thought about my Spanish classes. When we teach Spanish, we teach the Spanish subjunctive, that is the subjunctive mood. That is so hard to teach the Spanish to English speakers, because subjunctives exist in the English language, but it's not used like as we use it in Spanish. So it's about the language of emotions, of sadness, of something that does something to you that is different.
Mhm.
So then I thought, what about if I only talk about those moments that were like so shocking to me? The arrival into Japan, they getting the job, they go into this school, being told that I look like a pig, being in a car accident. I thought, I think I can do that. I can manage to do that. So I focused on those moments. So that's how I was able to conceive the book. I didn't have a diary. I, I, I didn't have so many things. I had like a box like this, a box of shoes, an actual box of shoes with my pictures of Japan, with a medal, with a couple of postcards. And that was my archive to do Kokoro. That was it. But obviously I had my memories. And also I went back to Japan because, see, I didn't think about the American or the Mexican public. I thought about, I was so obsessed with the Japanese public because I thought the Japanese readers, because I thought, what about the Japanese read this? And if they find a mistake, that will be so embarrassing. So let me go back to the city where I live and let me check out all the details I want to put in this book because I want to be thorough, as I did with Elector. With Elector, I was so worried about the historians reading me.
Mm.
This time I was with the Japanese.
Yeah, they're always there. Well, that's a fantastic answer, and